Switzerland, a place where humanity has asserted order, albeit in a small and controlled fashion, against overwhelming natural forces. Carl Gustav Jung was born near here 125 years ago and lived and worked in Switzerland until his death in 1961. Jung asserted order over the powerful inner forces of nature in the human psyche. He introduced the world to the idea of psychological types. He invented notions of introversion, extroversion, and a range of psychological complexes. He insisted on the existence of a collective unconscious, one populated by diverse archetypes. Jung's approach is centered on the process of individuation, a process of integrating opposing forces of the psyche. He's been gone for 40 years, but his legacy endures in the Zurich Institute that bears his name and among the world's analytical psychologists, better known as Jungians. They use his theories as a portal to the human psyche, to the realm of spirituality, dreams, and nightmares. But Carl Jung's influence extends far beyond the privileged confines of the consulting room. Some admire his work enough to travel thousands of miles to be in the company of like-minded people. For the better part of 2 decades, an annual conference has been held here in Einsiedeln, Switzerland, 40 kilometers southwest of Zurich, not far from Jung's family home. On the surface, Einsiedeln is the model of a quaint Swiss village. One hears the constant, oddly soothing sound of cowbells close by, sometimes harmonizing with the proud bells of the town's 14th century monastery in the distance. This year, the monastery is the site of the Welte Theater, held once every 4 years. This village spectacle, with a cast of hundreds, uses the monastery's cobblestones as a stage for exploring the nature of spirituality in the contemporary world. The Einsiedeln Conference is itself a stage for delegates to explore tangential aspects of Carl Jung's perspectives on contemporary spirituality, on dreams, and the nature of the psyche. This retreat-like atmosphere encourages explorations that are both personal and cultural.
This is my 16th year coming here, and I began because of my interest in the depth psychology of Carl Gustav Jung. And I realized the more that I learned about Jung, the more I also then began to see how his analytical psychology spoke volumes to me about the spiritual life. And so many people seem to have problems bringing these two disciplines together. And I thought this might be an opportunity to help Christians and even non-Christians find a way to understand better depth psychology and Christian spirituality.
This retreat-like atmosphere encourages explorations that are both personal and cultural.
Well, I'm here in Einsiedeln for the Einsiedeln Conference, which is very rich and very full. It has an incredible input from the most fantastic analysts from the Jungian Institute here in Zurich.
It is a place of transformation and a place where I think I can become centered, and I've experienced over the years that it is a place where really people come to really find themselves to be more transformed and to integrate that spirituality which they seek in their everyday life.
In 1982, I started to work on this idea of trying to find a place in Switzerland which is Mecca for Carl Jung. You know, many people ask me, why do you go to Switzerland? Why don't you do it in the United States? And I say to them, because it's not Mecca.
Einsiedeln has a long tradition as a point of Christian pilgrimage. Visitors come to see the mysterious Black Madonna housed in the Benedictine monastery that is the heart of this elegant, quiet town. And they come to honor the memory of a saint. In the 6th century, Einsiedeln was home to Meinrad, an isolated monk who was brutally murdered by 2 robbers to whom he'd given shelter. His life and martyred death were instrumental in the emergence of the Benedictine order in Switzerland that ultimately sent pagan spirituality underground. Einsiedeln was the 14th century birthplace of Paracelsus, who paved the way for modern medicine by introducing the world to the notion of the disease, a bodily affliction that might be treated with chemicals, rather than by bloodletting, the accepted practice of the time. And Einsiedeln was the breeding ground for the Swiss Reformation and Erlich Zwingli, who with Martin Luther led the hard-fought Protestant challenge to Rome. The annual Einsiedeln Conference is not out of step with this local tradition of revolutionary thought. Delegates to this conference are deeply spiritual on the whole, but like Jung, they're not afraid to challenge conventional religious doctrine.
It's the Jungian approach that also appealed to me very much because for Jung, spirituality is a fundamental thing. You know, Aristotle said man by nature is a political animal, man by nature is a rational animal. Jung says man by nature is a spiritual animal. And in our culture, the spiritual is not expected until recently. And so his system, his kind of therapy, brings out our native, our natural human capacity for spirituality. And that's what attracts me about Jung and all the people in this conference. They may be Christians, but they're also Jungians.
Many of the delegates are deeply involved in the rituals of their traditions, but each is on a quest that tries to make their religious inheritance relevant to modern sensibilities. The Jungian approach to spirituality is more concerned with probing questions and lived experience than with creeds and final answers.
Well, this is what Jung's point is that people, it may have been in the past, found their inner world in the church. Today they don't find it anymore. It doesn't speak to them. So he said, you can find meaning in yourself, in your inner world. The images are there spontaneously. And they become alive because they're connected to you and your own life and your own emotions and your own experiences. And then they have meaning.
The Jung Institute in Küsnacht, Switzerland, a suburb of Zurich, is a prestigious training center for analytical psychologists. The director of the Jung Institute in Zurich is a tall, soft-spoken Atlantan, drawn away from a professorship in philosophy when he discovered he was compelled to help, more than to educate.
And I did have a very secure job, and I liked it very much. And I always felt there was a little something missing, just a little, some kind of a dimension that was missing from teaching philosophy. And I discovered, I guess I noticed it first back during the Vietnam War, that people came to me for draft counseling, or in that same time period, sometimes they came for abortion counseling or some kind of relationship issues. They wanted to talk to somebody, they felt they could talk to me, and it didn't have much to do with my university job. And I thought way back then, that would have been 20 years before I became an analyst, that I wish I knew more about counseling and psychotherapy. So that was part of it. I wanted to be able to help people, and the other thing was I found Jung so interesting.
This isn't a conventional post-secondary institution. The entrance standards are invariably demanding and inescapably subjective. This is a school that reviews an applicant's experience of analysis as closely as her academic transcripts. The attendees aren't just learning about Jung and analytical psychology. They're learning about themselves.
Jung appeals to people who are troubled about the meaning of their lives. He also worked with people who were psychotic or people who had serious neuroses or something, but I always felt that he was especially appealing to people for whom traditional religion hadn't quite met their needs and who were looking for some hints or some support in finding more meaning in their individual lives. Not that he had a theory of the meaning of life. It wasn't so so generalized as that. People didn't come and he gave them the answer, but he helped support them in their search.
and immersion in analysis is a requirement. It's an experience that may alternately liberate or shatter the mind of a student. Embracing the Jungian approach is not for the faint of psyche. It is as much an act of courage as it is a challenge to the intellect.
If someone isn't called to go into this process of working with the unconscious, I think it's just as well to leave it alone.
Is Jungian training then a hero's journey, fit only for the psychologically strong, the emotionally educated, or is the analyst that most understanding doctor of all, the wounded healer?
I think it was Fats Waller who said, when they asked him about jazz, he said, what was the nature of jazz or the essence of jazz or something, and he said, baby, if you don't know, you better not mess with it. That's what I'd say about Jungian analysis.
In this conference, this question dovetails with spiritual questions. Is the Messiah the conquering hero or the suffering servant? Is the Buddha the one who is released from the great round or the one who returns to assist others along the way? In the 2000 Einsiedeln conference, Sophia, the feminine form of wisdom, is the theme. This theme is explored through the cultural roles of gender opposites, patriarchal versus matriarchal attitudes. Some conference presenters insist that we're entering a matriarchal age.
You know, the early paradigm number one, I call it, is the approach to the psyche via, in a way, more masculine approach. Objectivity, the psyche by insight and interpretation, which one can equate with St. George. Call it, it's more inspired by the father archetype, and the three founders of depth psychology, Adler, Freud and Jung, they have been fathers. And World War II put the world in a horrid catastrophe insofar as millions of families have been torn apart, millions of children lost their parents, lost their homes and countries. For these defects or deprivations, you cannot call them a conflict like the paradigm one, Freud, the Oedipal conflict, Jung, shadow, conflict with the unconscious, with shadow and so on. And for these disturbances and deprivations, wounds, you need a feminine approach. An approach that is based on the inspiration by the mother archetype, which is not playing the mother in therapy, but to understand and to give a holding and a safe place. And naturally, you cannot separate the two paradigms. They interact with each other, but this came more and more into depth psychology since World War II.
Conference delegates range from trained monastics, clerics, and priests to artists, social workers, and professors. Some are good-naturedly skeptical.